Hi, I'm Lois Kelly, and welcome to the Agile Uprising podcast.
On the second day of Christmas, my true love gave to me
2 turtle doves
and a partridge in a pear tree.
My name is Colleen Johnson, and you are listening to the Agile Uprising podcast. Welcome to our second in the 12 Days of Agile Christmas series that coincides our second principle with our 2 turtle doves. I'm joined today by Jay Hrcsko.
Hello.
And James Gifford.
Hello.
Welcome, guys. So today we're going to be talking about the second principle, welcome changing requirements even late in development. Agile processes harness change for the customer's competitive advantage. We're going to run through our same 4 questions here as we will through all of the principles in this series. So let's open it up with the first one here. Why is this principle important?
Ooh, Gifford, can I go first?
Sure can.
So as the resident PM, Agile PM around here, I have been fully sheep-dipped in the idea of delivering via waterfall. And the first thing that we can all, even if you're not a PM, the first thing that can throw off your project quickly is changing requirements. I think it was the Agile Samurai that said there are 3 absolutes about every project. You will never know everything you need to know to start a project. Everything you know will change, and there will always be more time than there will always be more work than time and money will allow. So that
I like that one.
the first 2 are really dovetailed together, right? Everything you learn during the project is inevitably going to change, and I have done my fair share of waterfall battles. And the first time things get screwy is the first time you thought you knew something and you realize you didn't. And what you thought you knew was wrong, and now you need to do a change request, a CR. And that's the first thing that'll sideline any project. And that was one of the things that, for me personally, was so inviting about Agile and iterative development. The fact that you're getting to smaller windows, smaller delivery timelines, you can adjust and absorb these type of changes easily or easier, one should say. And to me, that's huge because as you go, you're just going to learn more. There's a lot of, I hate to quote Donald Rumsfeld, but there's the known knowns and the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns. And those last ones are always the ones that catch up on you and can torpedo your initiative. So for me, this is important to me because I think a good team should get good at with just accepting, the peaks and valleys of a project and how it goes. And I think that's really, really important. What do you think, Gifford?
So I'm going to go back to my days as a developer. And when we had started experimenting with Agile, getting that instant feedback of, hey, we were totally wrong when we thought what we told you that it was supposed to work like that. Like, we were completely wrong. And it was always refreshing to know, well, let's make a trade-off and I'll fix this and we'll see if we have time to get to that later. I always had happier customers, and I worked as a data analyst on a team building an application before I got into development. And Jay, I can remember the torturous PCR processes. So this principle just does resonate home for me because I like delighting customers, and for them to get pretty much what they want or some version of it that we can make better later, it's just powerful. And a lot of companies still try to employ crazy PCR processes today, even when they're doing Agile.
What are your thoughts, Colleen?
Well, I mean, I think when you think about how fast everything moves now and how low the barriers are to entry for competitors to enter the space, this principle is more important now than I think it maybe even was when it was written, 15 years ago. So you think about welcoming those changing requirements. I think what you release today could be met with new competitors in 2 weeks. It's so easy to kind of jump into the game and jump into these different spaces. So you have to be able to respond quickly. And I think the companies that you see die, and these can be big big companies that have been around forever that end up losing their foothold because they can't change and they can't respond to their customers' needs, like this principle says. And I think that, this to me is more important now than it even was when it was written.
I would concur wholeheartedly. To your point, Colleen, especially the speed. I mean, most of us have been in IT for over a decade, and you look at, I mean, even just 5 years ago, how things moved, even in the Agile world, compared to how quickly they move today. It is almost insane that you could have someone come out with an idea and with a React.js WYSIWYG editor can have a working application
Right.
probably in a couple days
Absolutely.
off some cockamamie idea. That's where it really gets crazy, and you need to be comfortable with things changing as you learn.
Yeah, and I think you want, for a lot of organizations, they actively fight against change. And it shoots them in the foot, right? They're trying so hard to come up with a plan and stick to a plan and plan out every sprint and forecast what's going to be delivered every sprint. And they cripple their ability to be responsive. And that's the whole point of doing Agile, right? Is that you can quickly respond to what's changing and what your customers are asking for. In a lot of ways, it's like, why even embrace all of these practices if you're not also going to welcome that every sprint should change, or every item in your backlog can change daily, because that's kind of what we're trying to get to with this flexibility and fluidity.
And I think that it's to kind of what resonated with me about the notion of people are afraid of the change or managing change. One of the things that I've been doing a lot with companies is working on basically a business outcomes template, which is essentially just a canvas that goes through the pros and cons of why we're doing this, and the benefit to the customer and what outcomes we're going to expect. But so instead of funding the entire $1 million that this whole this canvas or a series of canvases for a larger program, we only give you enough money for a quarter's worth of money. So we know what the team's run rate is. And once you start kind of introducing some of those concepts, that whole notion around PCRs and the worry about the budget, it definitely starts to go away, because as people start to measure those kind of outcomes, and they can see, hey, we were totally heading in the right direction, or we're way off. They know that, hey, we only spent 60 grand and we stopped doing what we were doing. And that's when I think that's the mindset shift that would help actually people start to embrace this practice more. When they start looking at the cost benefits, how many times have you been, Jay, or Colleen, in the middle of a project and you're 75% through the budget and the customer's seen it and they're like, yeah, this isn't what we wanted at all. And so now you're going back to ask for more money to make it right.
Right. Yeah. No, and unfortunately, I feel like a lot of us have been through those projects where it's been a huge miss, and you don't find out, get that feedback until it's too late to respond to it. And you probably could have gotten that feedback earlier if you had the opportunity to put it in front of the users sooner.
And it's the worst feeling in the world, right? When you're sitting there and you've put you and your team have put your heart and soul into something, and then have the customer give you this sort of look like, thanks, but I was expecting this, and this is this is something different. It's the quickest way to kill motivation. The teams, you can't help get upset and get aggravated, and to your point, James, I think it does deal a lot with how people deal with change as a whole. The whole Kubler-Ross 5 stages of grief and how that relates to how people work their way through a change cycle, and it's the worst feeling in the world. So we need to get comfortable with the idea of change for the customer's advantage.
Do you guys have any personal examples where this principle was kind of thrown out the window, and what happened to the project or the team? Because I think you're 100% right, Jay, that this has such a negative impact on team morale. So take away the financial impact to the organization or the potential loss of customers or customer revenue, but the morale hit is huge. Do you guys have any stories you can share about specific projects or teams that have gone through that?
Yeah, so I was helping a large I guess it's a life sciences company, rebuild an e-com platform. And we sat them down and we had the discussion around what's the minimum viable thing we could deliver for the time frame that we had and still deliver a product to our customers based on some usability testing and some company feedback. And basically the VPs were like, well, it's not good enough unless we have this, that. We better nickel plate, gold plate this. And, so the team set out to deliver. And we got, we went through basically 12 weeks of development, and we brought customers in for them to kind of look at it. And with the VPs in the room, the customers just completely crapped all over everything that we had kind of delivered. And they're like, you know what, if I was a big hospital, all these metrics and graphs that you've delivered us would be great, but I'm a small mom and pop's retailer, and all I really care about is seeing my inventory levels and maybe some basic usage data. And the team was just completely deflated because, I mean, it had like when you mouse over graphs and you're on a line chart and it pops up and it gives you like cool percentages and all this really interactive charts. And the team is like, we just spent 12 weeks pouring ourselves into all this crazy charting, long nights, weekends, just to have the customer go, yeah, we don't need that. And I mean, it totally deflated the team, and it took them at least 4 sprints to get back up to even pace, or even really showing an interest. And I could even see a dip in quality because they were so deflated.
Yeah.
It's crushing, right? It takes the wind right out of the sails. For me, almost the same experience. I was working at a large financial institution, and I was working on this weird, esoteric, obscure project on how to handle past due buckets on a customer when they enter and exit a payment program, either successfully or unsuccessfully, right? So you can imagine already, it's collections, it's credit cards, banking, it's who is past due, so it's a collections customer, so it gets even more obtuse. And then what was in the 30-day bucket, 60-day bucket, 90-day bucket when they entered the program? Did they successfully exit? Did they fail off? Were they re-aged? Were they recycled? All this crazy stuff, right? I ended up with this enormous Visio I had to print out in a plotter with all the decision points. And we get all the way to the point where we think we got it. And some random analyst from the business MIS side, who was not part of the program team, not part of the project team at all, comes in and what amounts to the 11th hour and says, oh, well, what about this? And I forget what the this was. It was something about with the customer aging right before their due date or some wonky sort of fringe case, which it's a fringe case, but it upset the fundamental assumptions that we were building this whole logic module on. And the team was just mortified, right? Because I have an entire cubicle full of plotter paper of all these enormous Visios that all these hours went into that basically just got thrown right out the window. And we should have, in hindsight, it could have been done more iteratively. I mean, this was with a company that was just dipping their toe into the Agile water, and this is one of those projects we tried it with. So I really can't fault the company itself. However, but this is the textbook example of shorter iterations and being able to welcome change, because this almost destroyed the entire project. I went back to the well for so much money. I was actually only a business analyst on this program, and it got to the point where my boss took the project manager off because none of them could understand what I was talking about with the program. And I just started representing it as the PM because I was closest to it. And to the point where the head of development, when she saw me coming looking for more money, she just nodded, said, how much longer do I need? Gave me the money, and that was the end of it. It was a mess. It was an absolute mess. How about you, Colleen?
Yeah, I tell this story quite a bit, so a few of you may have heard it. I worked for a web and audio conferencing company that competed with WebEx and GoToMeeting, and we had been receiving a lot of requests to implement a way to play clips of videos in your presentation so that you would push them to your audience would stay in sync with the video and the audio, and You could push a poll or talk over it and pause it. So we started down the path of this project, and we were using Scrum at the time. We had really planned out every 2-week sprint way at the beginning of what we were going to get done and what we had to complete in each sprint in order to hit our milestone. And about halfway through this project, Flash support shit the bed, and we had to start all over. And so fast forward, this project took us 18 months to get out the door. And we released it and had an epic party with shirts and beer and hats. And we had a waffle bar where you could cook bacon into your waffles. And
oh, that sounds so good right now.
And I mean, it was an epic party and a huge relief to everybody to have it done, like you were describing. And it was crickets, right? Nobody used it. So customer care started reaching back out to users to say, why aren't you using this? Isn't this what you asked for? You requested this and we invested all this time and money in it. And they were like, oh, that's not what we meant. We wanted a way to play clips back of a video from a previously recorded presentation. So if I've given the same talk 15 times, I can just push that part of the talk and then answer questions over it. So we completely missed the mark. And again, I think we're all kind of saying the same thing. If we had done this in a more incremental fashion where we were inviting that change into the process and inviting that feedback into the process in a way where we were saying, is this what you want? No, great. Let's refine it. Let's get it right. Let's keep iterating on this so we make sure we've got your problem solved. And we didn't do that. We spent 1.5 years building the wrong thing and ended up having to start all over on the solution they actually wanted. I don't think anybody ever actually used that stupid feature at the end of the day.
That's crushing. That's crushing.
It is. And the team's devastated afterwards, right? That's a lot of their time and brain power that goes into building that new feature that nobody wanted in the first place.
Well, on the almost other side of this coin, I have an example recently of where welcoming change actually worked. So there's a team I'm currently Scrum Mastering that's doing primarily we're plugging away at integration pieces between one vendor built system and our internal custom systems. And a change came up out of the blue where we need to change the actual language and architecture that we're using to deploy this code. So we went from one type of network and utility that's basically run by the enterprise to a completely different one, which is based on, long story short, it's based on OpenShift. So it'll give us the functionality to use Docker and Kubernetes and all this fun stuff. And it really is the right decision for the organization. But this came out of nowhere. So we had to, okay, well, let's go back to the drawing board and see what we got. And because we were looking at small chunks and because the team was comfortable with things changing, we basically all went into a room for a grooming session. I gave a bunch of developers markers and said, okay, well, now with this change, everybody goes up to the board and write the things that we're not thinking about. Write the things that off the top of your head, we're going to have to be concerned about. We spent an hour in a room and we came out with, okay, this is going to end up costing us, an arbitrary number of 30-something points. And in my next update, it was, okay, well, due to the change in approach, we had to change our architecture for the deployment of the integration code. However, it only affects 30 points. We've already slotted it for this sprint, and that sprint, so we look to be complete by this PI, blah, 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 blah. So because we were working iteratively and because we're comfortable with the idea of change and it wasn't a big deal, the team, I was expecting them to be all up in arms, and everybody just sort of went, shook their heads and said, okay, here's my estimate. Let's get back to work.
That's awesome. Well, and I think a lot of times you hear teams push back on the ability to welcome change because they feel like so much is planned out for them in advance. So this is something that they don't feel like they have control over. Giff, I guess I'd ask you, have you ever, how do you encourage a team to take ownership for welcoming change at the team level if they feel like they can't do that at the organizational level?
That's always a tricky one. So I think one of the most welcoming change events that we had was when the corporation said, we need to get the mobile platform usage up of our product, and they literally had no strategy for how to do it. Literally 2% of the entire population of customers used the mobile platform because it was just awful. And they were like, well, I mean, the worst case thing we do, we send a product owner, a designer, and a developer out to the customer and just have them watch for a day. And for them to kind of even think about that, based on our coaching suggestions, that was them welcoming a change in the way that they had thought about doing it. And it was the miraculous thing about that was they got those 3 people out in the field working with some people in the stores. They realized that, they're using this gigantic laser looks like a Star Trek like blaster to like scan labels on a shelf. And like then they type in some numbers, and so like they go through this whole rigmarole of watching them basically take that scanner and create an order with it. And the designer and the developer got scratching their heads. The developer was like, look, I saw this awesome scanning software, SDK at a trade show. We could totally pull this in and build a native iOS app around this and give them like a iPad, or not an iPad, but an iPod Touch. And then the designer's like, well, here's how we could do some screens. Literally on the plane ride back to the office, they come up with this concept. 2 weeks later, there's a prototype built. The next week, they're back out in the field. That experiment ends up going on to save the company like $6 million in proprietary hardware. And now the person can literally do their job standing in the aisle of the store. And the mobile usage of the product was up to 98% when it finally released.
That's awesome.
The full version of it. And it was like some people taking that courage to embrace the change of how they go and get requirements.
Yeah, I love that example because it's out, I think, where the 3 of us started with our stories, we're all around how the work gets broken down, right? It has to be incremental. We have to be able to put things in front of customers incrementally to get that feedback to harness change. And I love that in this example, you started way at the beginning before, like you said, before requirements are even written, to really understand those needs from the very beginning.
I think a big part of the challenge to teams to welcome change, a big part of this ties to modern agile with creating a safe environment. If you can show someone that it's okay we've created this environment and we're not going to get mad or get upset or report a project red or whatever if requirements change, if we need to pivot and what we were doing needs to get thrown away and we do something new, setting that stage makes it easier for the team to accept the idea, to welcome change. And then to them, it's just another day in the office. The teams that are new to the agile world, I was lucky enough to most recently take over a team that was just getting started with it. Once we established the idea that it's okay that things are going to change and we'll just we'll adapt and deal with it as we go. When things come up now, it's not a big deal. It's more of okay, well, let's replan and see what gets shifted, what comes in and what goes out. And a big part of that is making the environment comfortable for that team to say, okay, well, if things change, it's not just a big deal. I can get away. I can deal with it. It's not like someone's going to come down from the top of the mountain screaming at me. And setting that expectation, I think, for me, has been huge, because it allows people to just, like you said, James, work themselves through that natural life cycle of how people deal with change, and they get comfortable with it.
So Jay, how do you encourage that at an organizational level? So taking this up now from the team, because I think one of the things I've seen a lot is even in some of the companies I've worked with where they're doing Agile by the book, and they've got their Scrum practices down or their Kanban practices down at the team level. There's still a product roadmap in place for the next 2 years that says what feature is going to be delivered on what date, and there's no room at that level in the organization to invite change. So what are your recommendations for starting to welcome change in at that level?
That's a tough one. So teams are much easier to influence in organizations because they're smaller and more localized. At the organizational level, well, I've had some luck with just not playing dumb, but playing dumb, asking the people at the I guess if we're talking safe, like the portfolio level or even the value stream level, to use for lack of a better example, asking them, well, give me an example of another roadmap where it didn't go so well. And everybody's got those stories, those tribal knowledge stories of projects that have went on for years and years and years, and nobody wanted to kill it. And what they thought they wanted, they launched 5 years later, and it's completely different. And when that example comes back, my response is usually, so we would be better served by thinking in smaller increments, right? We'd be better served with more frequent touches to our customer to really ascertain where they want to go with it and then build that. And sometimes I'm successful. More often than not, I'm not. It takes constant reinforcement to get people to get it. But you can't. I'm starting to see my current gig. I'm starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel. But it's really comes down to, again, setting the expectation that, well, look at what we've done previously, and that didn't work. Do we really want to do that again? Let's try and do it a different way. And when you start getting people thinking in those smaller increments, and okay, change isn't a bad thing because we're not spending 18 months hammering away on a program to come to find out that the customer, we gave them veal parmesan and they wanted veal piccata or chicken parmesan, right? I always go back to the chicken parm example. We're not spending so much time. That's not so much waste. It becomes easier, and it's a slow process, but it does work. What have you seen, Colleen? How have you been successful with getting organizations comfortable with the idea to welcome
Oh my God.
change?
Well, I think that this is, like you said, it's very hard at the organizational level. And I've been on a little bit of a death of the product roadmap crusade over the last couple months, just because I think it's such an antiquated practice when you hold it up to what we're trying to do with Agile to try to forecast out what you're going to deliver in 12 months. So I like to start there and try to implement a practice for looking at things in the backlog at a product level as options, right? These are all options of things we could do based on feedback we're getting from things that we've already deployed. So creating a, kind of a giant feedback loop that says, at the end of this quarter, we hope to have these 4 or 5 features deployed, and kind of like James was saying, what outcomes do we hope to get from that? And what will those outcomes tell us that will help us pick what to work on in the next quarter? And that often means that you have to have more options available to you than you're going to select, right? Otherwise, they're not really options. And that's a challenge
Right.
for a lot of organizations. But I think if you can detach yourself from the concept of that plan, I think that plan creates a sense of security, and it's a false sense of security that these are the things we're going to do and these are the things we're going to deliver. And you have to really detach yourself from that and be a little more fluid in what you're going to work on and let the customer kind of dictate what's going to be next. And I think the first part's kind of letting go of that product level roadmap.
I will say, Gifford, before you respond, I will say on one of the funniest, not funniest, but almost enlightening remarks was made in my current engagement. I'm knee deep in what was envisioned to be this somewhere between 5 and 7 year program roadmap, like you said. And I actually had someone who was responsible for making one of those giant Gantt charts that goes all the way out into 2022 turn to me and say, "I'm never doing a roadmap like this again. It didn't survive the first 12 months." And we had a laugh about it. But my response was, so is the problem that we created the roadmap, or the problem that we spent so much time trying to time box everything? And the response was, you know what? It was helpful to create the roadmap because it forced us to think of the things we may inevitably want. So that wasn't a bad exercise. The rough exercise was trying to figure out, okay, well, this will take 9 months to develop, 2 months to pilot, another month to load customers. The response to me was, the woman said to me, okay, so I think it was worthwhile to at least do the thought exercise, but I don't think we should have spent 6 months building this roadmap that, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. Building out all these dates and timelines that were completely thrown out the window in the first 12 months of running the program. Gifford, I sort of stepped on your response. What are your thoughts about us introducing this idea of welcoming change at the enterprise?
So one of the things that I would tell you that we need to focus on descaling enterprises instead of scaling agility, but that's a talk for another day. But no, one of the things we've been doing kind of, so at the output of what the teams are working on is basically a set of business outcomes in a canvas. One of the things that we started doing was I took Jeff Patton's story mapping and upscaled it into the planning onion, so it is at the enterprise level. And so you're basically going from the organizational strategic objectives down to the outcomes that we want to potentially deliver to reach those strategic outcomes. So, Colleen, you were kind of talking about looking at, potentially more options. So now you have we had an actual wall that was literally like, here's all the strategic objectives all the way down to potential outcomes that we're going to do to, you know, so satisfy these. And then we would actually do some quarterly rolling plans. So where Jeff would, at the end of that story mapping session, have you come in and slice out the releases and then the delivery strategies. We're actually going in and saying, all right, we're going to do a quarterly roll. So what are we thinking we want to validate in this quarter, and then having them go build. And if it's successful, we just keep chewing along on those options with that train of thought, shuffling the priorities based on the feedback coming in, but actually having a big visible wall of, here's the corporate strategic objectives, and then here are the outcomes that we think are going to potentially get there. Being able to have that as an information radiator, so anybody in the company walking through actually sees, here's our corporate goals for the year. Like, are we aligned? It's an information radiator that says, this is working. Everybody can see what's in flight, things that died because it wasn't working, things that are moving on. That's been one of the biggest ways that I've been able to really, that's one of the most effective ways I've seen kind of changing that mindset in the upper level and the organizational level, is put them right front and center of their goals so that everybody has to walk by them every day and we can see where the company is going and whether we're hitting outcomes or not.
Yeah, I love that, James. I think just the visibility, when you tie that into decision making, is something that's often lacking from that ability to make change, to make change quickly in an organization, because that plan gets put together and published somewhere and stored away on a drive and never looked at again until next quarter. But when you have that visibility across the organization, you get to really see what everybody's working on across the groups and say, is this the right thing? Do we need to make a shift? And where does that make sense? You guys both touched on something I want to circle back to real quick around the concept of short increments and commitments. And I guess I want to challenge some of what we do and ask you both, do things like PI planning in a scaled Agile framework, or even the concept of committing to what we're going to deliver at the end of 2 weeks. Are those types of things counter to this principle?
Fundamentally, I could argue either way. I could see where they would be counterproductive to the idea of accepting change. If you're committing over 2 weeks, if you're to use the safe example, committing to what you're going to do in the next 10 weeks, it does sort of spit in the face of the concept of welcoming change, because as soon as you accept a change, then everything gets thrown right out the window. What do you think, Gifford?
I mean, I've stopped using commitment altogether. It's a forecast. And I can't tell you how many sprints we've had where we didn't map dependencies right, or, we got some new insights in late in the game and we had to drop stuff and then just move on to the next most valuable thing. So, even in a sprint. So for me, I stopped talking about commitments. This is what we think we're going to deliver. And this is what we forecast we're delivering, not this is what we're committing to deliver, because things change. We're discovering things that are unknown, especially on new projects, greenfield. Maybe you're using brand new technologies. So, I mean, having a general path that we're going to go down, it's good to have, but you need to be able to change quickly if you hit that fork in the road. So I've stricken, literally we have whole arguments around changing the message into forecasting and not commitments.
That's a good point, because that's a really strong word coming from the one guy here who's not married. Commitment sort of terrifies people. The idea of commitment does terrify people. What my team has started doing is, we don't commit to stories. We don't commit to points. What we do is we say, okay, for this sprint, what do we want to accomplish? I want to finish up the batch job that's pulling the file coming out of Oracle and spitting it into a service. And we just make those sort of statements. And the assumption is with that statement comes a whole shit ton of user stories and tasks and all that to go with it. And as things come up, we'll say, okay, well, we need to change this goal for the sprint. We wanted to finish this interface, but it doesn't look like that's going to happen. Instead, we need to work on standing up this environment to get the integration piece ready. So you're right. The word commitment is strong and it does scare people. I'm not against it, but I do think it's easier to commit to or discuss a goal for what you're going to do in the next increment, the next iteration, as opposed to saying I'm going to complete 32 points of X amount of stories with Y amount of time. It's unrealistic because it doesn't welcome change.
And I mean that's why I would actually prefer to work in a time boxless environment. I mean, I get more enjoyment out of working in a more Kanban fashion where we're just continuously filling the list of the next most priority, most important things to the organization. If I could do more transfer, if I could start people out on a less Scrum focused journey, I think the conversation changes too. I mean, it is all within the delivery mechanisms that you choose that a lot of these bad things come to light. I've had more successful, more happy teams delivering in a Kanban manner where they're not doing sprints and being pushed to give commitments and trying to figure out how to jam something into a 2-week time box. Not that I'm saying that Scrum's not valuable, but
Right. Colleen, what do you think about does maturity have something, team maturity, have something to do with the idea of commitments versus, to James's point, he said, I'd like to not start teams with Scrum and start them with Kanban where they just get used to the idea of work in progress and a flow-based iterative delivery method. Do you think how mature a team is comes into that scenario and makes it either easier or harder?
Absolutely. Yeah. I get that question a lot, actually, if I would start teams with Kanban. And, I think the consultant answer is depends, right? But, I think like I'm working on a big transformation project right now. And for a lot of these groups a lot of these new teams where we're kicking Scrum off, the concept of a 2-week commitment it's light years ahead of what's happening right now. And they don't even think that seems possible. So welcoming change into 2 weeks is very reasonable, right? Waiting 2 weeks to see something prioritized is such a dramatic improvement over what's happening now. So I do kind of view that as a stepping stone to getting to more of a continuous flow model. That being said, there's a couple teams there where we're implementing Kanban without implementing Scrum. And we're doing that for the teams where their priorities are constantly different every day. So just that concept of a commitment or a target for their sprint would, I think, cripple their morale and enthusiasm towards a new process from the very beginning. So we're taking some of the ops teams and some of the more operational teams and saying, let's start you guys out with Kanban from the very beginning so that you can welcome changing priorities on a daily basis and make sure everybody in the organization is pleased with what you're delivering and can see what you have on your plate. So, and that, in that case, it's not maturity. It's more about the type of work that's coming in on a regular basis and how frequently it's changing.
Awesome. I personally think my experience has been the team I'm currently with now, as they've gotten more mature, we have shied away from the whole rigid sprint planning, sprint commitments, PI planning. And it really has almost a Kanban under the covers appeal where it's really just flow. We have a rough idea about what our priorities are, and we just pull the work in as we go. As one gets done, we pull the next highest priority thing. And it just flows to the point where sprint planning is almost a non-event. PI planning for us is a non-event because we have the work already in our heads about what we need to do. We just let it flow through the system naturally. It is literally Kanban under the covers with the 2-week increments jammed on top of it for for perfume on a
Yeah, and
pig's
I
sake.
think in a lot of ways, those 2-week increments then become your checkpoints, right? And I've seen teams kind of in the middle of transitioning to a more traditional Kanban approach do exactly what you're describing, where it's Kanban under the covers, but you're kind of bookending that with checkpoints from a Scrum perspective of are we on track? How does this look with our overall objectives? Does anything from a priorities perspective need to change? And I think those compare nicely.
Yeah, agreed.
All right,
I would agree with that as well.
We're getting to the end of our series here. So to wrap up, I want to ask if we were to redo the actual Christmas Carol of, what are we on? Two
turtle doves.
Right, two turtle doves. What would we title this step on the second day of Christmas my Agile mentor gave to me? James, how about you first?
A hall pass to the Gemba.
2 of them.
2 hall passes to the Gemba.
I'm going to say 2 features with defined fluidity. Sort of stay with the rhyme there. Because the defined fluidity is it's consistently going to change. Amorphous is a word I used in a meeting the other day, and everybody was like, what is that? How do you spell that? But you get where I'm going.
Yeah, I like that. I'd probably say 2 available options to select from. I like
Perfect.
it. I like it. Well, that is about a wrap for us for our second day of Agile Christmas. If you're enjoying these, please consider giving us a review on iTunes, Stitcher, or your podcasting platform of choice. Ratings and comments, if we haven't offended you, definitely help others find us. And you can also contribute to the Agile Uprising by making a contribution to patreon.com/Agile Uprising to keep these podcasts alive and going. Definitely join the conversation by sharing your experiments and thoughts around the principles and all of the things we're talking about during this series at the coalition.agileuprising.com. And thank you guys for joining us. Happy holidays.